For 2 years, Paul lived with the gnawing uncertainty of his younger brother Mark's disappearance, a case the police had long since dismissed as a runaway. The silence is shattered by a phone call from the sheriff's department. A teenage girl fishing by the Cypress Creek has reported a chilling sight: a large alligator with a battered white bicycle helmet in its jaws, the same model Mark was wearing the day he vanished. The discovery drags Paul back into a mystery he thought was buried forever, forcing him to question everything he knew about his brother's last day. What really happened on that quiet afternoon in '96? Stick with me as we unravel a story of teenage secrets and a truth that refused to stay submerged. The silence in the Sanders home was a heavy, suffocating thing. It had settled over the house 2 years ago, in the summer of 1996, and had never left. It was in the empty chair at the dinner table, in the dust gathering on the video game console in his brother's room, and in the space between his parents, who now moved around each other like strangers. At 20 years old, Paul Sanders felt more like a caretaker of a museum of grief than a young man with a future. He worked shifts at a local auto parts store, the scent of rubber and oil clinging to his clothes, and came home to the same quiet house, the same unspoken pain. Mark had been 16 when he disappeared. One moment he was there, clipping on his white bicycle helmet, grabbing his bike from the garage for a ride, and the next, he was gone. He'd had an argument with their parents about his curfew, a typical teenage spat. When he didn't come home that night, they assumed he was staying at a friend's house to cool off. But one day turned into two, and then a week, and the search began. The police found nothing. No bike, no helmet, no Mark. After a few months, they settled on the most convenient theory. Mark had run away. It was a clean, simple explanation that closed the file, but left a wound in their family that never stopped bleeding. Paul was fixing himself a sandwich in the quiet kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon in 1998 when the phone rang. The sound was jarring, an intrusion. He picked it up, expecting a telemarketer. "Is this Paul Sanders?" a man's voice asked, calm and official. "Yes. Who is this?" "This is Detective Joseph from the Sheriff's Department. I'm calling about your brother, Mark Sanders." Paul's hand tightened on the receiver. His heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. Cops didn't call about 2-year-old runaway cases. "What about him?" he asked, his voice tight. "A report came in about an hour ago from a witness down at Cypress Creek," the detective said. "A young girl was fishing and saw a gator. A big one. It had something in its mouth. It was a white bicycle helmet, Paul. It had some distinctive scuff marks and an old sticker on the side." Paul didn't have to ask. He knew. It was a sticker from a local skate shop, one Mark had put on his helmet just a week before he vanished. "I'm on my way," Paul said, his voice a hoarse whisper. He hung up the phone without another word, the half-made sandwich forgotten on the counter. He grabbed his keys, his mind a whirlwind of hope and terror. For 2 years, he had been trapped in limbo. Now, something had finally broken the surface. The drive to Cypress Creek was a blur. The familiar Florida landscape of hanging moss and dense green foliage felt alien, menacing. When he arrived, he saw the yellow police tape first, cordoning off a muddy section of the creek bank. 2 patrol cars were parked haphazardly on the grass. Paul got out of his truck and was met by a man in his 40s with tired eyes and a compassionate expression. This was Detective Joseph. "Paul, thanks for coming so quickly," the detective said, shaking his hand. He gestured toward a teenage girl sitting on the tailgate of a pickup truck, wrapped in a blanket, talking to a female officer. "That's Sarah. She's the one who saw it." Paul's eyes scanned the scene, landing on a blue evidence tarp laid out on the ground. On top of it sat the helmet. It was caked in mud and green algae, and a chunk of plastic was missing from the side, revealing the foam underneath. The puncture marks were deep and unmistakable. Alligator teeth. But through the grime, he could see the faded corner of the skate shop sticker. It was Mark's. A wave of nausea washed over him. "It's his," Paul said, the words catching in his throat. Detective Joseph nodded grimly. "We recovered it from the bank after the gator dropped it. Sarah said it was swimming right over there," he said, pointing to a spot in the murky water. Paul stared at the location, and a new kind of chill, one that had nothing to do with grief, snaked down his spine. He knew this stretch of the creek. He knew every property that backed up to it. The spot the detective was pointing to was less than 100 yards from the sprawling backyard of the Walker family. And in '96, his brother Mark had been dating their daughter, Ashley Walker. The police had questioned Ashley 2 years ago, of course. She was Mark's girlfriend. But her story had been simple and solid. She was home with a bad case of the flu the day Mark disappeared. Her father, a stern, imposing man named Roger, had backed her up completely. He told the police he was home taking care of her all day. Ashley claimed she hadn't spoken to Mark that day and had no idea where he was going. With no other leads, the police had moved on. But Paul remembered more. He remembered the arguments. Mark's relationship with Ashley had been his first serious one, and it had become suffocating. Ashley was jealous, possessive. In the final weeks, Mark had been miserable. Paul remembered his brother sitting on the edge of his bed, frustrated, just a few days before he vanished. "I have to end it, Paul," he'd said. "She won't let me breathe. I'm going to tell her this weekend." That weekend was the weekend he disappeared. "Detective," Paul said, turning away from the creek, "the girl he was dating back then, Ashley Walker, her family's house is right there." Detective Joseph's eyes narrowed slightly. "I remember the name from the file. She had a solid alibi." "Maybe it wasn't as solid as it looked," Paul insisted. "He was going to break up with her. I know he was." A new energy pulsed through Paul, a grim sense of purpose. The police might have thought Mark ran away, but he never believed it. His brother wouldn't have just left without a word. Not really. Now, with the helmet found so close to Ashley's home, the runaway theory felt weaker than ever. Something had happened to his brother right here, at this creek, and he was suddenly sure that Ashley knew more than she had ever let on. He looked at Detective Joseph. "I need to talk to her." The detective held up a hand. "Paul, let us handle this. We'll go and speak with the Walkers again." "With all due respect, Detective, you spoke to them 2 years ago and got nothing. She knows me. Maybe she'll say something different to me." Before the detective could argue, Paul was already walking toward his truck. He wasn't going to sit on the sidelines any longer. For 2 years, his family had been passively waiting for an answer that never came. Today, the creek had given them a sign, and Paul was going to follow it, no matter where it led. He drove away from the police tape and the grim discovery, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, heading for the Walkers' house. The Walkers lived in a large, 2-story home with a perfectly manicured lawn that sloped down to the creek. As Paul pulled into the driveway, he saw Roger Walker in the yard, pulling weeds from a flower bed with methodical precision. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a face that seemed permanently set in a disapproving frown. He looked up as Paul's truck door shut, his eyes narrowing. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "I'm Paul Sanders," Paul said, walking across the lawn. "Mark's brother. I need to speak with Ashley." Roger stood up, wiping his hands on his pants. "The police were just here. We told them everything we know, which is nothing." Ashley was very upset by their questions. "I'm sure she was," Paul said, his tone even. "They found Mark's helmet in the creek this afternoon, right behind your house." A flicker of something, surprise, or maybe fear, passed through Roger's eyes before his expression hardened again. "That's a tragedy, but it has nothing to do with us." Just then, the front door opened, and Ashley stepped out. She was 19 now, home from her first year of college. The years had changed her, but the same intensity was there in her dark eyes. She froze when she saw Paul. "Paul? What are you doing here?" "Ashley," he said, stepping past her father. "We need to talk. About Mark." "There's nothing to talk about," she said quickly, glancing at her father. "It was a long time ago." "They found his helmet, Ashley, in the water. Right there," Paul said, pointing toward the creek. "He told me he was coming here to break up with you that day. Did he make it?" Ashley's face went pale. "No, he never came here. I was sick. My dad was with me all day." She was reciting the words like a script she had memorized years ago. "Leave her alone," Roger boomed, stepping between them. "You have no right to come here and harass my daughter. If you have questions, talk to the police. Now get off my property." Roger's hostility was like a wall. It was too forceful, too protective. It wasn't the reaction of a concerned neighbor. It was the reaction of a man with something to hide. Paul looked from Roger's angry face to Ashley's terrified one. He had his answer. They were lying. He backed away slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "All right. I'm going." He got back in his truck, his heart pounding. He drove a little ways down the street, pulled over, and immediately called Detective Joseph. He recounted the entire conversation, the rehearsed alibi, Ashley's fear, and Roger's explosive anger. "They're hiding something, Detective. I've never been more sure of anything in my life." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Their reaction is noteworthy," Detective Joseph finally said. "I think it's time I took a much closer look at the original case file. Stay put, Paul. I'll call you back." As Paul sat in his truck, the humid Florida air thick and heavy around him, he stared back at the Walker house. The perfect lawn, the big windows, the quiet suburban facade. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the truth about what happened to his brother was inside that house, and it was a truth they were willing to do anything to protect. An hour later, which felt like a lifetime, Detective Joseph called back. His voice was different, charged with a new energy. "Paul, I found something. It was a minor detail, something that seemed irrelevant at the time, so it was never followed up on. The day after Mark went missing, Roger Walker rented a piece of equipment from a local hardware store. It was a commercial-grade, gas-powered water pump." Paul frowned, confused. "A water pump? Why?" "His reason on the rental form was a flooded basement from a burst pipe," the detective explained. "But I just checked with the utility company and the town's public works records. There were no major storms that week, and no emergency plumbing calls were ever made from that address. His basement didn't flood." Paul's mind raced, trying to connect the dots. A water pump. The creek. The house. And then it hit him. On the edge of the Walkers' property, half hidden by overgrown bushes, were the gaping mouths of two large concrete drainage pipes that emptied into the creek. "The pipes," Paul whispered into the phone. "Detective, there are drainage pipes on his property. Big ones." A heavy silence fell on the line. Paul knew they were both thinking the same terrible thing. You wouldn't need a high-powered pump for a simple basement flood. But you would need one if you wanted to flush something, or someone, out of a drainage pipe and into the deep, murky waters of Cypress Creek. The next morning, Paul was back at the creek, but this time, the scene was different. A large county forensics van was parked on the Walkers' lawn. Detective Joseph had gotten a warrant. The area around the drainage pipes was now a full-blown crime scene. Paul watched from a distance as a team of investigators and waiters began to work, setting up equipment around the mouth of the larger pipe. He saw Ashley and Roger standing on their back porch, their figures rigid with tension. Hours passed. The team sent a remote camera into the pipe first. Then, they began to carefully excavate the mud and silt that had built up over 2 years. Around noon, one of the investigators emerged from the pipe, covered in mud. He walked over to Detective Joseph and spoke in a low voice. The detective's posture straightened. He looked over at Paul and gave a single, solemn nod. They had found something. Paul watched as they brought out a long, sealed evidence bag. Inside, caked in mud but still recognizable by its frame and handlebars, was a bicycle. A few minutes later, they brought out another, smaller bag. This one contained the tattered remains of a wallet. Then came the final, gut-wrenching discovery. They brought out a body bag. Standing on their porch, Ashley Walker let out a sound, a choked, agonizing sob, and collapsed. Her father, Roger, didn't try to comfort her. He just stood there, his face ashen, a statue of a man whose lies had finally crumbled around him. At the station, the story came tumbling out. Ashley, confronted with the undeniable evidence, confessed everything. Mark had come over that day, just as Paul had said, to end things. They had argued down by the creek bank. It got heated. She screamed at him, begged him not to leave. In a moment of pure frustration, she shoved him. It wasn't meant to be violent, just a push. But Mark was standing on slick, moss-covered rocks at the water's edge. He lost his footing, his arms flailing, and he fell backward. His head hit a jagged piece of limestone with a sickening crack that echoed across the water. He was gone instantly. There was no splash, just a terrible, final stillness. Panicked, Ashley ran to the house, screaming for her father. Roger came running down, saw Mark's body, and his mind immediately went to protecting his daughter. He was the one who came up with the plan. He knew the drainage pipes were rarely full unless there was a major storm. They dragged Mark's body and his bike into the larger pipe, shoving them as deep as they could into the darkness. The next day, Roger rented the water pump to wash away any evidence from the rocks, and then threw Mark's helmet far out into the creek, praying the alligators and the current would create a story that would lead everyone away from their door. For 2 years, it had worked. But a recent flash flood, the biggest in a decade, had sent a powerful surge of water through the drainage system, dislodging the helmet from whatever it had been snagged on and pushing it out into the main channel of the creek, where a gator, and then a young girl, had found it. The news was a brutal, devastating blow to Paul and his parents. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by the horror of the truth. Mark hadn't run away. He had been taken from them in a single, senseless moment, his death covered up by a desperate father trying to save his child from the consequences of her actions. Ashley and Roger Walker were arrested and charged. The trial brought the whole painful story into the public eye. In the end, Ashley was convicted of manslaughter, her father of accessory after the fact, and obstruction of justice. A week after the verdict, the Sanders family held a memorial for Mark. They gathered at the edge of the ocean, a place he had loved, and shared stories of his short, vibrant life. The suffocating silence that had filled their home for 2 years was finally beginning to lift, replaced by shared words of remembrance and grief. As Paul watched the sunset, he felt the heavy weight he had been carrying for so long finally ease. The mystery was solved. The lies were exposed. He had found his brother, and now, at last, he could bring him home and let him rest. The healing could begin. What do you think is the line between protecting a loved one and committing a crime to cover up their mistake? Share your thoughts on this complex moral question in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking and subscribing. Your support helps us continue to bring these important narratives to light.